To relations between the United States and Russia, they've taken a turn for the worse. The United States accuses Moscow of conducting tests in violation of a 1987 nuclear missile treaty. According to U.S. officials, Russia tested a new ground-launched cruise missile, which breaks an agreement signed by U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. This latest confrontation follows the release of U.S. satellite images, which purport to show Russia's direct involvement in the conflict raging across the border in Ukraine. In response, the United States and the European Union have now increased sanctions to punish Moscow.
The United States is imposing new sanctions in key sectors of the Russian economy: energy, arms, and finance. We're blocking the exports of specific goods and technologies to the Russian energy sector. We're expanding our sanctions to more Russian banks and defense companies. And we're formally suspending credit that encourages exports to Russia and financing for economic development projects in Russia. At the same time, the European Union is joining us in imposing major sanctions on Russia, its most significant and wide-ranging sanctions to date. In the financial sector, the EU is cutting off certain financing to state-owned banks in Russia. In the energy sector, the EU will stop exporting specific goods and technologies to Russia, which will make it more difficult for Russia to develop its oil resources over the long term. In the defense sector, the EU is prohibiting new arms imports and exports and is halting the export of sensitive technology to Russia's military users. And because we're closely coordinating our actions with Europe, the sanctions we're announcing today will have an even bigger bite.
Blair Ruble is Vice President for Programs at the Wilson Center and Senior Advisor to the Kennan Institute. I spoke with him earlier from Washington, D.C. Blair, welcome to Arise America. Thank you so much for being here with us. Just a short time ago, President Obama made some remarks about increased sanctions imposed by the U.S., which would target Russia's energy, weapons, and finance industry, including big banks, what they had already announced a few days ago. What's your reaction to these new round of sanctions?
My reaction is that the U.S. government is in a very difficult position to figure out how to respond to Russian behavior, and given the fragility of the Russian economy, this seems to be both the weakest point and the one area where the U.S. can try to exert leverage. Sanctions are always tricky. It's not clear how, to what extent sanctions work, but it does fall into, I think, the general thinking in Washington about our best way to respond to what's taking place, both in Russian-Ukrainian relations and more generally in the U.S.-Russian relationship.
Yeah, I think everybody acknowledges that the sanctions that are really going to be effective are the ones that will be imposed by the European Union. They have agreed upon a stricter round of sanctions. Is that going to be enough to motivate Putin at all to change his behavior in regard to the crisis in Ukraine?
I'm not sure in the short run that it will change Putin's behavior. If anything, I think Putin has always demonstrated that he's stubborn, and he may actually hunker down a bit. But I think there are economic realities, and before the whole Ukrainian conflict exploded, the Russian economy was already on shaky grounds, and the European connection is important in ways in which the U.S. Economic connection, quite frankly, is not. So I think that over the medium term, there will be pressure on Putin to respond. In the short run, I would imagine he's going to discount the impact, but I'm not sure that he'll be able to do that over several weeks and months ahead.
Let's turn the corner, talk about another very important issue as it relates to U.S.-Russia relations, and that is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was signed under Ronald Reagan's administration with Mikhail Gorbachev. The United States has alleged that Russia has violated this treaty by launching a ground-launched cruise missile. First of all, if, in fact, Russia has violated this treaty, how serious is that?
I think actually what's more serious about this is the fact that the U.S. is talking about it. Because I think that it's a sign that the U.S. believes it has no way of generating a positive, constructive Russian response behind closed doors. This is serious because these are treaties which have been the bedrock of U.S.-Soviet and U.S.-Russian relations really for the past generation. And if the Russians have flagrantly violated, not a small violation, but a serious violation, and are not responding to our expressions of displeasure, then the U.S.-Russian relationship is headed into a very dangerous place because it means that the normal kind of back and forth that has marked the relationship for a long time is no longer taking any effect.
You raise a very important and sinister point. Of course, back in 1987 when this treaty was reached, it was hailed as the official end of the Cold War. So if this violation is substantive, as you say, does it restart the Cold War?
Well, I think we have to be a little bit careful about talking about the Cold War. The Cold War, at the time this treaty was signed, both countries were existential threats to one another. I don't think there are too many people in Moscow or in Washington who believe that the other country is an existential threat. And that really does change the calculus. Russia is not the Soviet Union. It doesn't have the resources or capacities that the Soviet Union has had. The whole global context has changed. So I'd be a little bit careful about talking about going back to the Cold War. What I think is true is that there's very little grounds for any positive movement in U.S.-Russian relations. And I think we're looking at a very prolonged period of displeasure in both capitals with one another. And it's going to be a rough ride ahead. But it's not going to be exactly a replay of the Soviet-U.S. relationship.
Blair, very quickly, because I'm almost out of time, is there a possibility that Russia would elect, that Putin specifically would elect, just to pull out of the treaty?
I think at this point, all bets are on the table. I think given his recent behavior in Ukraine and indeed around this test, yes, that is a possibility. Yeah. And that would not be good.
That would not be good at all. That's an understatement indeed. Blair Ruble, thank you so much for your expertise and time. We do appreciate it.
Thank you very much.